One Shade of Plum Crazy by Richard L. Elsliger. I knew the history. I knew what I was buying. The car, an old first-generation Dodge Challenger, had a dark past. Locals asserted that this particular car had claimed 6 lives over the course of its sordid history. I was in line to become the 7th owner. I stared at the old purple Challenger sitting in the disheveled garage, and not a hint of its dark past could I appreciate. I particularly liked the color, plum crazy. I believed it was a Dodge color, a corporate term of art for that special shade of purple, a befitting description for such a crazy past. I questioned the seller, a widow, who claimed that her husband had died recently under extraordinary circumstances that she would not elaborate upon. Out of respect, I refrained from probing for details, and I most certainly did not want to thwart the sale. I tendered her a certified check for the agreed-upon price, a price negotiated well before I even saw the car, relying upon a professional hired gun to appraise the old mammoth. Looking at the car now, the appraiser did not disappoint in his assessment, and the photographs hardly did the car any justice. The paint alone, from the areas exposed under the light, presented an immaculate sheen. The widow drew up the paperwork post-haste. Her face reflected a sense of relief at the completed transaction, an elation she exuded in her every gesture that the car was finally gone. The Challenger, a 1970 big block 4-speed, broadcasted a confident show of strength merely by its static position in the garage, engine off and windows shut. Some moldy old carpeting and a few empty buckets were scattered over the roof and hood as makeshift attempts to insulate the paint from moisture and grime. Dust coated the windows, obscuring the interior, though my expert had gone over the car thoroughly before I arrived, and also confirmed that all the numbers matched. The body panels were original too, as was the 440 cubic inch ground pounder of an engine. The car gave not a hint of its past, and rumors were nothing more than empty ghosts with no shred of credibility, at least by my way of thinking. True that her husband died, as she claimed, but who was to say that the car was responsible? The Challenger looked completely intact, so if the car caused his demise, it wasn't by way of a crash. Perhaps he might have died from carbon monoxide poisoning, but even so, that was a circumstance governed by unfortunate fate, and the car merely served as a vehicle to facilitate his exodus across the river Styx. The widow handed me the keys, and I thanked her. I removed the pails and carpeting from the hidden body panels to reveal the unusual paint scheme beneath. The purple hue glistened under the artificial lights. I wiped away the dust from the windows with a damp cloth, then got in and inserted the ignition key. A twist of the wrist started her right up, having been previously primed and gone over by the inspector I'd commissioned before taking the plunge to buy the old relic. The engine thumped with a primitive note, a crackle from the exhaust that suggested an era long since past. I found reverse on the pistol grip shifter and backed the car out to the light of day. The Challenger bathed in the sunlight, gratified for the reprieve away from its garage-based prison. The car seemed alive with an ardent desire to get away on the open road, as did I. I put away the paperwork in the glove box and backed out of the driveway. I saw a forlorn look on the widow's face, a remembrance leaving her life forever, for though she believed the car had taken her husband, she also knew that it was a thing he cherished, a thing that was part of his being, and now it was no more. The interior smelled new, as if I'd driven off the dealer lot in 1970. I rode through the gears and merged onto a highway, watching the speedometer creep up to a respectable integer of velocity. This car was a brute in every way and lacked any of the refinements of today's automobiles. She was built for speed and knew it. I pressed the throttle and the response was instantaneous. I wondered about the predecessors of this car, why they would sell such a precious piece from the muscle car era, and my mind drifted to the admonitions of the widow, that 6 people had died, that this car proved lethal to all who took on the responsibility of ownership. The research conducted by my hire, my expert if I may, revealed none of her contentions. Old rumors and dark fables died hard, and even in death they somehow revived themselves and lived on in elaborate far-fetched tales of doom. I watched the gas gauge needle drop in quick increments and believed I had my answer for the constant transfer of ownership over the decades. Rising gasoline prices and poor gas mileage certainly provided the needed incentive to get rid of this car, and that in all probability is exactly what happened, not for the rumor of some death machine that killed its owners. A car of that repute would certainly have been removed from society and sold for scrap, yet here it was, eating asphalt and giving me the thrill of my life. I exited the highway and located a gas station that sold high octane, pulling in to the nearest one. I sidled up to a pump and removed the nozzle, dumping gallons of liquid gold into the gas tank, filling the gullet of this beast. When I was done, the price shock at the pump might have dissuaded previous owners, but failed in its effort to deter me from motoring on. I paid without a care, wheeling the monster out of the station with many onlookers aghast at the polluting dinosaur. I drove unabated along the coastal highway until sunset and then headed home. Pulling into my driveway, I imagined what thought-provoking reaction the Challenger might have elicited from my ex-girlfriend in better times, what she might have thought about this luxury purchase, this total and unnecessary whim of mine. I suspect she would not have approved. Why life so often presented an either-or decision I could not rightly say, but it seemed a constant adjunct to my existence, that I could have one or the other of my desires, but never both. I vowed that the next relationship would be one of mutually enjoyed interests, or I would void the relationship into a nullity at its very inception. She would need to accept my eccentricities, and I hers, but the one non-negotiable would be this plum-crazy Challenger. I have no intentions of selling. This car is a keeper that I plan to own till death do us part. I drove the purple people-eater into the garage and paused, letting the engine idle. The pistol-gripped shifter vibrated with each stab of the gas, the exhaust snarling in its wake. I killed the engine and sat in the driver's seat, inhaling deeply the vintage odors of this antiquity, fueling my sense of wonderment. My mind took a temporary excursion into the recesses of my past, and I concluded that overall, my life had not been so bad, and today I enjoyed a relative happiness. I really never wanted for anything, but somehow I really wanted for this Challenger, and I could not say why with any measure of reason. It spoke to me in silent ways. I gripped the wheel and banged through a couple of practiced shifts. The rearview mirror reflected my eyes back to me in a haunting manner. For an instant, the eyes that stared back were not my own, but the eyes of many others. It startled me, and I pushed back in the seat. I looked again and saw my familiar eyes once more. What a strange occurrence. I dismissed it, assigning the aberration to euphoria over my purchase. The human mind proved most capable of self-deception in such moments of excitement. I exited the Challenger, leaving the garage. I took one last look before shutting off the overhead light. That evening, I suffered sleep disturbances like never before. Visions of the Challenger, my Challenger, hunting me on side streets and back alleys. I eluded capture by sheer wit and resourcefulness, locating narrow drives that prevented the Challenger's access. I woke up screaming at 4:40 in the morning. It took time to resume my sleep for fear of a recurrence. I'd had nightmares in the past, but none so lifelike or of this magnitude. I managed to drift off and slept undisturbed until morning. When I awoke, the nightmare had faded to nothing more than a dim recollection, quite incapable of causing any further harm. My eyes opened to bright sunlight invading my bedroom window, casting brilliant rays upon my face. The sun roused me from my lethargy, and I arose feeling energized, brushing aside any remnants of that freakish nightmare from but a few hours before. I threw on a pair of jeans, a t-shirt, and driving shoes, the shoes being a silly affectation of mine that once annoyed my ex-girlfriend to no end. Maybe it caused our breakup, I could not say. I decided on a quick breakfast and finished with a cup of coffee. Today would be a card date to detail the Challenger with a wash and a wax. I entered the garage and opened the large paneled door, letting the warm Sunday morning sun infiltrate and reflect upon the interior. I stepped in the Challenger and started her up, back in the old relic to the driveway. I parked her on the grass, a soft carpet of green that contrasted the outrageous plum-crazy paint. I silenced the engine and commenced my well-worn regimen of detailing. I began with a pre-rinse, followed by a thorough soaping from the rooftop down. What a joy to detail one of Detroit's finest specimens. I felt in my element, bathing in the California sunshine and detailing a gorgeous Plum Crazy Challenger on a Sunday morning. Could life possibly get any better? Once I completed the wash and dried off the paint, I retreated to the garage and dug out a bottle of fine carnauba wax that I'd purchased with the best of intentions, believing one day that I might use this wax on a dream car, and now that day had arrived. I used meticulous precision, applying the carnauba wax to the roof in sections, and when I removed the dried wax, the paint reflected a mirror finish deserving of such a fine machine. I moved to the A pillars and then the C pillars, applying and removing wax while my mind drifted to faraway places, distant roads that led me to a state of driving nirvana. When I got to the driver's side drip rail, I made a swipe of the applicator across the paint and caught the palm of my hand on a chrome insert that ran along the side window. A few sporadic dots of blood came rushing to the puncture mark, and it stung like an insect bite. "Damn it," I said, pulling my hand away from the paint and chrome. I squeezed on the puncture, but no more blood could I produce. I shrugged it off and resumed my job, always a finisher on any task that I began. At the end, my Challenger sparkled in the noon-hour sunlight like a contender for the Pebble Beach Concours d'Elegance. She looked ready for a drive along the coastal highway, and that is exactly where I headed. The drive up the coast took me on beautiful two-lane blacktop with the Pacific Ocean my constant companion. The road twisted and writhed like a centipede, and I thrilled in every turn, my driving shoes assisting in the heel-and-toe ballet dance of the 3 pedals and a manual transmission. I felt a minor discomfort in my right hand each time I shifted, and that detracted from the unabated adventure, but I pushed the discomfort from my mind. I would fix that jagged edge of chrome to avoid any repeats next time I detailed the car. When I arrived home, I parked the Challenger outside so I could appreciate her from my living room window. I prepared dinner and brought my plate and drink outside to sit on the steps and enjoy the setting sun. I stared at the Challenger while I ate. It sat in silence on the driveway, telegraphing eerie sensations to me in its silence, sending jumbled messages from the past that I could not decipher. I put my fork down and listened, but heard nothing. The headlights stared back at me, hollow orbs without emotion, unable or unwilling to tell me the stories behind them, the stories about the prior deaths associated with this car. It was hard to believe rumors, to fall prey to unfathomable and doubtful legends, but right now, right this very minute, I sensed an unusual presence in my driveway, an object that held its many secrets in abeyance, secrets that culminated over the half-century of its existence. I finished my food, gulped my drink, and went back inside. Nightfall demanded that I put the Challenger away, and I left through the open garage to the cooling outdoor air, taking a deep breath, happy to be alive in the moment. I got in the Challenger and turned the key, but nothing happened. I twisted several more times, but the engine refused to turn over. Dead battery, I thought. I took the car out of gear, exited, and began to push on the A-pillar while holding on to the steering wheel. Surprisingly compliant, the Challenger rolled forward, and I managed to push the car all the way into the garage without event. I closed the door and retired to the living room to decipher this engine problem. It had to be the battery. I fell asleep on the sofa while researching car batteries, seeking the most compatible and period-correct one for the Challenger. In a dream state, I found myself still sleeping on the sofa. I heard the Challenger start up from the garage. In my dream, the exhaust rapped in an aggressive way, demanding my attention, enticing me to investigate. When I woke up, I was standing at the side entrance of my garage, staring down at the Challenger from the steps. How did I get here? I never walked in my sleep, and waking up from a standing position alarmed me. I reoriented myself and switched on the overhead light. Nothing looked out of place. The Challenger's headlights stared back at me with a vacant look, beckoning me to get closer. I dutifully complied. I walked down the few short steps to the concrete floor and drew closer to the Plum Crazy fossil. When I passed the driver's fender, I detected a wave of heat radiating from the engine. I immediately put my hand to the hood and felt warmth. How could this be? I replayed various scenarios attempting to make sense of this enigma, none of them providing a hint of any logical explanation. I couldn't start the car, and nobody else could either. The battery was clearly dead, and by application of common sense, so was the engine. I questioned the veracity of my dream and wondered. The warm hood belied the dream. Had I fixed the problem and started the car in my sleep? I checked the ignition and saw it devoid of any key. I checked my pocket and withdrew the Challenger's key. I got in to test my hypothesis, to see if the engine would indeed start, but as before, the car refused to turn over. What a bizarre situation. I shrugged and went back into the house, falling asleep once more, this time choosing the compatible venue of my bedroom. I woke up to a painful right hand. I examined the palm in detail and saw redness and minor swelling. I cursed that jagged piece of chrome. Attending to the wound with my left hand, I squeezed the puncture and a few dribbles of blood came forth, but nothing further. It hurt this morning with greater intensity than when I first incurred the injury. I went to the medicine cabinet and took out a bandage, strategically placing it over the puncture, allowing for the medication on the gauze to directly contact the wound. I checked my watch. I needed to step up the pace and get to work. It wasn't Sunday anymore. It was Monday. When I arrived at my office, a stack of files teetered on my desk. I lived the life of an accountant, a boring life that my parents impressed upon me at an early age, but a stable position nonetheless. In the final analysis, my career choice might better have explained my need for a 1970 Dodge Challenger. I'm still in my early 30s, with a lot of time left on my life clock, and I have every reason to believe that this Challenger and I will have many exciting times ahead. I dove headlong into work, numbers assaulting my mind, and by late afternoon, I had slashed that pile in half. I checked under my bandaged hand and noted that the wound was not getting any better, but in fact had turned significantly worse. A colleague entered my office at the defining moment and saw the injury. She commented that I should get that looked at straight away. I agreed and left early. On the way home, I stopped off at a doctor's immediate care clinic and presented the hand for further inspection and diagnosis. The first question was whether I got stung by a bee. I denied the assertion, telling the good doctor that I cut my hand on a piece of chrome trim while waxing an old car. The doctor summarily asked if I was up to date on my tetanus shot, and I told her I didn't know. She advised I go to the hospital and get a shot to be on the safe side. I complied and drove straight to the hospital, getting the recommended injection. I made it home in good time and parked my daily driver next to the Challenger. The tetanus shot actually made me feel better, but I suspected the effect was more psychosomatic than actual physiological improvement. I checked my watch. It was early enough, so I called an old friend. Dan had always been an enthusiast for vintage cars, having owned a Plymouth Satellite at one time in his life. When I located and bought the Challenger, I withheld critical information in my purchase with the surreptitious intent to capture an element of surprise. When I called Dan and urged him to come visit, I hinted at the lurking mechanical beast within the garage, and he wasted no time appearing on my doorstep within the hour. He rang the doorbell like a rapid-fire machine gun until I opened. "So what do you want to show me?" he asked. "It's in the garage," I said. "Oh, this is going to be good," he said. I let him in, and we went to the side door and cracked it open. When I switched on the light, he became immobilized on the spot. "You've got to be kidding," he said. "A Challenger? Are you serious?" "Take a look," I said. Dan scrambled down the stairs, nearly tripping on the last step. He pored over the car, examining every detail. He checked the interior, confirming the 4-speed on the floor. He looked directly at me and asked, "So when are we going for a ride?" I told him that the battery was dead, and he began spouting his knowledge about batteries like an encyclopedia, testifying to the availability of period-correct reproductions. I told him I put one on order and expected its arrival within the week. Dan settled down, and we left the Challenger in the garage to catch up on our respective lives. In the living room, he noticed my hand and asked what happened. I told him it was nothing, just a scratch from working in the yard. I dared not tell him it came from the Challenger, as I did not want to impugn the integrity of the car. He suggested I see a doctor, to which I responded that I'd already been administered a tetanus shot at the hospital earlier this evening. That ended the inquiry, and we talked at length about old Mopars and life. I withheld information about the Challenger's history, sensing that he might think less of me if I expounded upon an unsubstantiated rumor. I promised him he could drive the Challenger once the battery arrived, and he left with an amped enthusiasm I'd not seen in Dan for such a long time. I fell asleep again and dreamed of the Challenger, hearing the engine start and the exhaust note crackle in my garage. Again I awoke upright, standing in the garage, staring at the old relic, unable to explain how or why I sleepwalked my way over to the car. My hand at this point had swelled to the size of a balloon, and the pain ran up my arm with ruthless efficiency. A fever had set in and gave me a crushing headache. What exactly was going on here? I knew that I was in dire need of immediate medical attention, so I drove myself to the hospital and made it to the front desk before collapsing on the floor. When I woke, the midday sun was upon me, shining through the windows of my hospital room. I had a burning fever, and my right arm hung useless at my side. I could no longer move my right fingers. The doctor entered the room and began asking me questions. I told him all that I knew about the injury from its inception to my present state. He told me that he'd not seen this sort of infection, and neither had his staff, but reassured me that they were doing everything to save my arm. That sent an electric shock through my whole body. Save my arm, I said. I could lose my arm? The doctor locked eyes and told me that the infection is of unknown origin and advised that he and his staff were doing everything to get it under control. He expressed his doubts that such an infection could arise from a single cut on a piece of chrome. He told me to get some rest and left with his clipboard. I tossed my head back to the pillow, helpless to stave off this fulminating disaster. I thought once more about the curse of the Challenger, but dismissed it as pure nonsense. I slept through the afternoon and awoke to 3 doctors standing around my bed in the early evening hours. I looked at them, and they looked at my arm. They inspected the half-eaten flesh and glistening bone that traversed my forearm down to my fingers. The sight of my bones poking through necrotic flesh terrified me to the core. "What is happening to me?" I demanded. "We don't exactly know," was the answer. The attending nurse changed my bandages and gave me a shot of morphine before dressing the wound. The rotted flesh smelled awful. "Am I dying?" I asked. One of the doctors looked at the other for an answer, his eyes virtually answering my own question for me. "We're doing everything we can, Mr. Randolph. We're waiting for the lab results, and they should be in very soon." All I could do was thank them and allow the nurse's assistant to feed me. My right arm was useless now, and likely would be gone within the day, judging by my own personal assessment. I began imagining life without my right arm. How would I ever sign my name again? How would I pick up a utensil to eat? How would I hold a sandwich? How would I drive the Challenger? This cannot be happening. The nurse helped me finish my dinner and left me to my misery. I thought more about the Challenger's ominous history and spent the evening absorbed in dark thoughts. The head nurse checked on me periodically, and by nightfall I observed that the infection had spread to my chest and down my leg. She called the doctor, and when he came to check on me, the look of horror on his face told me everything that I needed to know. I did not have very long. I slept through the night, but not without more bad dreams, all of them centered on the Challenger, stalking me along boulevards and alleyways. The seriousness of my situation revealed a terrible truth, that in fact my car was a killer and wanted me dead. Come morning, I woke up screaming, unable to see out of my eyes for the flowing tears. Streams of wetness ran down my face and trickled into my mouth. I tasted the iron-like quality of the tears and knew them to be tears of blood. I wiped my eyes with the bedsheet and saw holes in my chest with exposed ribs and melted flesh. I knew that I would not last another night. The doctor said that the lab results were like nothing they'd ever seen before, but they had the top medical specialists on the case. They said it appeared to be an aggressive hybrid illness, a cross between Ebola and necrotizing fasciitis. Whatever the name, I knew the cause, and I also knew that I would not last another night. My body was rotting, preparing me for my grave ahead of schedule. Who else could boast of such a rare privilege? I asked for more morphine and arranged for the hospital to call my parents and Dan. I suffered throughout the day, drifting in and out of consciousness. Late in the afternoon, my parents arrived from out of state, and Dan came directly from work. I could not speak by this point, but I could hear, and I listened to the grim prognosis. Apparently I was not expected to make it through the night as I suspected. I had to let them know about that car. I had to let them know that it needed to be destroyed. I heard my mother crying and my dad inconsolable. With me gone and no will, I could expect the dispersal of all my possessions to the four winds, and that included the Challenger. With a half-open eye, I saw my friend Dan sitting off in a corner, sporting a summer tee emblazoned with a Plum Crazy Challenger, inked across the chest. Owner number 8 would soon be joining me, and I had no way to let him know. If only I could let him know.